Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements, and we're going back in time almost 20 years to an important essay on social constructivism that I think is underread and understood. Friend of the show, ghost of Christopher Lash on Twitter, and author of Paroxysm Substack on Substack, has been also reintroducing Ian Hacking's work from 2006, which was published in the London Review of Books. I am very careful about doing London Review of Books articles because I don't like violating copyright, but this one is available in full, publicly, and for free. So I feel like it's fair game, and this is fair use. This article also has some verbiage that we would consider out of date today, and and a few other things that would have been risque in 2006, but not particularly as inflammatory as it is now. That's a little caveat that I shouldn't have to do, but I do think we have to do for a variety of reasons. And Ian Hacking is one of the philosophers that I think actually did responsible social constructivism instead of a lot of the stuff you saw out of post-structuralist and post-Marxist France, which use scientific concepts kind of metaphorically and analogously in ways that were often not helpful at all or misunderstood them. One thing I'll give about Hacking, though, is going a little bit into taxonomy as a scientific inquiry and how that affects social construction and social being, is that I do think this is going to make a lot of people's folk Platonism uncomfortable. Yes, we say that identities and categories and diagnoses, particularly mental diagnoses, are substantively real, but socially constructed. But we often ignore what that means and take a very strategic essentialist view of those kinds of developments. So we're often, frankly, talking about something as socially constructed and thus not like innate, even if it might have some innate characteristics, but then also talking about the social construction as if it does not change or has been immutable from some set time period in the deep past. So let's get into the article. If you want to find this, it is available for free online at London Review of Books, but it is from volume 28, number 6, and August 17th of 2006. 19 years ago. Oh no! All right. It's bigger for you. Sorry. There we go. All right. Quote Hacking. I've long been interested in classifications of people and how they affect the people classified and how the effects on the people in turn change the classifications. We can think of it as a feedback loop. We think of many kinds of people as objects of scientific inquiry, sometimes to control them, such as prostitutes, sometimes to help them, such as potential suicides, sometimes to organize and help, but at the same time keep ourselves safe as the poor or the homeless, sometimes to change them for their own good and the good of the public, as the obese, although not anymore. I don't know where we are with this, not anymore, a decade ago. Sometimes just to admire, to understand, to encourage, and perhaps to emulate, as sometimes geniuses. We think of these kinds of people as definitive classes by definitive properties. As we get to know more about these properties, we will be better able to control, help, change, or emulate them better. But it's not quite like that. They're moving targets because our investigations interact with them and change them. There's no static definition here. There's no way to remain a static definition. Like the moment you start interacting with the category and refining the category, you are changing the category. And people start responding to you in ways that, frankly, reinforce the category or break it. And since change, they're not quite the same kind of people as before. The target has moved. I call this the looping effect. Sometimes our scientists create the kinds of people in certain sense that did not exist before, and I call this making up people. What sciences? The ones I call the human sciences, which, thus understood, include many social sciences, psychology, psychiatry, and speaking loosely, a good deal of clinical medicine. I am only pointing, for not only is my definition vague, but specific sciences should never be defined except by administrative and educational purposes. Hacking's trying to avoid the demarcation problems. Living sciences are always crossing borders and borrowing from each other. Yep, that's actually true. Which is part of the problem of the demarcation of scientific fields. The engines used in these sciences are engines of discovery, but also engines for making up people. Statistical analysis of classes of people is a fundamental engine. We always try to medicalize. Doctors tried to medicalize suicide as early as the 1830s. The brain of suicides were dissected to find a hidden cause. More generally, we try to biologize, to recognize a biological function for the problem that besets a class of people. So we're kind of biological Platonists. More recently, we have hoped to geneticize as much as possible. We're moving away from that, but we were for a long time. Thus, obesity, once regarded as a problem of incontinence or weakness of will, becomes a province of medicine, then of biology, and at present, we search for inherited genetic tendencies, and actually, since then, we've been looking for epigenetic or tendencies, our social conditions are all of the above, which I think it probably is. Genetic, social, personal will, etc., etc. There's all kinds of stuff playing into this. A similar story can be told in search for criminal personality. These reflections on classification of people are a species of nominalism. But traditional nominalism is static. Mine is dynamic. I am interested in how names interact with the named. The first dynamic nominalist may have been Nietzsche. An aphorism in the gay science begins, "There is something that causes me great difficulty and continues to do so without relief. Unspeakably more depends on what things are called than on what they are." It ends with, "Creating new names and assessments and apparent truths is enough to create many new things. Making people up would be a special case of this phenomenon." Now, in Buddhism, there's this dynamic nominalism already existed. It's called the Pinnacle Rising. But the predominant philosophical tendency in Western thought has been either Aristotelianism or Platonism, both of which have ultimate causes, which are static and unmoving by definition. Either the forms are the unmoved mover in its emanations, depending on which paradigm you're going with. And most people, whether they realize it or not, whether they think they're materialist or not, talk about concepts as if they are static. Someone told me once when I was talking about fascism that fascism had a definition, and I'm like, it's a definition that's socially agreed upon. And if we don't socially agree upon it, maybe it actually doesn't. It has historical case points of people that called it that, and there are consequences to expanding or contracting the category, but it is not an ontological thing that exists in the universe. There is no concept of fascism eternally in the world unless you believe in a metaphysically separate universe in which concepts, and not souls or whatever, are supremely important. Many mathematicians do, even if they don't realize it, but nonetheless, this is the case. Around 1970, there arose a few paradigms of cases of strange behavior similar to a phenomenon discussed a century earlier and largely forgotten. A few psychiatrists began to diagnose multiple personalities. It was rather sensational. I saw many movies about it as a kid. More and more unhappy people started manifesting these symptoms. At first, they had symptoms they were expected to have, but then they became more and more bizarre. First, a person had two or three personalities. Within a decade, the mean number was 17. This fed back into the diagnoses and became part of the standard set of symptoms. And this is a problem in a lot of psychiatry and psychology in general, because the psychiatry and psychology diagnosis are clusters of symptoms. Sometimes there are associated genetic triggers, like with schizophrenia. Sometimes there are associated biological symptoms that are testable. Sometimes there are genetic triggers of whether or not the drugs used to treat the diseases will work. But often, it's just a cluster of sometimes very vague symptoms that together indicated diagnosis. All right. This fed back into the diagnosis and became part of the standard set of symptoms. It became part of therapy to elicit more and more alters. Psychiatrists cast around for cases and created a primitive, easily understood pseudo-Freudian etiology of sexual abuse coupled with repressed memories. Knowing this was the case, patients obligingly retrieved the memories. More than that, it became a way to be a person. In 1986, I wrote that there could never be a split bars, analogous to gay bars. This in 1991, I went to my first split bar. This story can be placed within a 5-part framework. We have a classification, multiple personality disorders associated with what at the time was called a disorder. This kind of person is now a moving target. We have B, the people, those who I call unhappy, unable to cope, are relatively non-judgmental term you prefer. We would now call them sufferers of post-traumatic stress disorder for the most part. There are C, institutions, which include clinics, annual meetings of the International Society of the Study of Multiple Personalities and Dissociation, afternoon talk shows on television. Oprah Winfrey and Geraldo Rivera made a big thing of multiples once upon a time, and weekend training programs for therapists, some of which I attended. There is D, the knowledge. Not the justified true belief, once the mantra of analytic philosophers, but knowledge in Popper's sense of the conjectural knowledge, or more specifically, the presumptions that are taught, disseminated, and refined within the context of the institutions. Especially the basic facts, or so-called facts, are facts in scare quotes. For example, multiple personalities is caused by early sexual abuse, that 5% of the population suffer from it, and like. There is expert knowledge, the knowledge of the professionals, and there is popular knowledge shared by a significant part of the interested population. There was a time, partly thanks to the talk shows and other media, when everyone believed that multiple personalities was caused by early sexual abuse. Finally, there are E, experts or professionals who generate D, knowledge, judge its validity, and use it in their practice. They work within C, the institutions that guarantee legitimacy and authenticity and status as experts. And they study, try to help, or advise on the control of B, people who are classified as A, as a given kind. This Beto framework can be used for many examples, but the roles will be different in every case. There is no reason to suppose that we shall ever tell 2 identical stories of 2 different instances of making up people. There is also an obvious complication. There are different schools of thought. Oh boy, are they. In the first instance, there was multiple movement, a loose alliance of patients, therapists, and psychiatric theorists on one hand, who believed that this diagnosis and that a certain kind of person, the multiple. There was a larger psychiatric establishment that rejected the diagnosis altogether. A doctor in Ontario, for example, who, when patient arrived announcing that she had multiple personalities, demands to be shown her Ontario health insurance card, which had a photograph and name on it, and says, "This is the person I am treating, nobody else." Thus, there are rival frameworks and kinds of reactions and counter-reactions between them further to contribute working out of this kind of person, the multiple personality. If my skeptical colleague convinces his potential patient, she will very probably become a very different kind of person from the one she would have been had she been treated for multiple personalities by a believer. And this has a lot of implications for identity, people. I would argue that the multiple personality of the 1980s was a kind of person previously unknown in the history of the human race. This is a simple idea familiar to novelists, but careful philosophical language is not prepared for it. Pedantry is in order. Distinguish the 2 sentences. There are no multiple personalities in 1955. There are many in 1985. B. In 1955, there was not a way to be a person. People did not experience themselves in this way. They did not interact with their friends, their family, their employers, their counselors in this way. But in 1985, this is a way to be a person, to experience oneself, and to live in society. As I see it, both A and B are true. An enthusiast for what is now called dissociative identity disorder will, however, say that A is false, because people with several altered personalities undoubtedly existed in 1955, but were not diagnosed. A skeptic will also say that A is false, but for exactly the opposite reason. Namely, multiple personality has always been a specious diagnosis, and there are no real multiples in 1985 either. Statement A leads to a heated but pointless debate about the reality of multiple personalities, but in my opinion, both skeptics and enthusiasts can peacefully agree to B. When I speak up making up people, it is B that I have in mind, and it is through B that the looping effects occurs. So he's not saying that there's no cluster of conditions that really exist for some of these disorders that did not exist in the past. And this will really be important when we talk about things like autism or gender disorders, etc. Not that there weren't people with gender disorders in the past, but that they would not have understood themselves in that way. There was no way for them to categorize themselves in that framework. That does not mean the dysphoria and everything else that they are experiencing is not real. But that is a cluster of things that we have put together as a kind of person. And that's true even for heterosexuality and homosexuality. Both are relatively late developments to the discussion of sexuality and are not really considered in any framework or fashion in the ancient world. Yes, we know people committed heterosexual acts and loved same-sex partners. We don't have a lot of evidence that they thought this was essential in an ultimate way, at least not a ton. Maybe there's a few bits of evidence here and there. Which does not mean they experienced attraction to the opposite sex. That's a weird term in and of itself, but nonetheless, it just means that they might not have understood what they were going through as a sexuality and the way that we might understand that in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Anyway, multiple personality was renamed dissociative identity disorder. I've met someone with a dissociative identity disorder, and it doesn't really feel like multiple personalities, but I'm not going to get into this. It does feel like something, though. But that was more than an active diagnosis. That was more than an active diagnostic outcleasing. Symptoms evolve. Patients are no longer expected to come up with a roster of altogether distinct personalities, and they don't. This disorder is an example of what in my book, Mad Travelers, 1988, I call transient mental illness. Transient not in the sense of affecting a single person for a while and then going away, but in the sense of existing only at a certain time and place. Transient mental illness can best be looked at in terms of ecological niches in which they appear and thrive. They are easy cases for making up people precisely because their very transience leads to cynics to suspect they are not real and could possibly be said to be made up. But even if they are made up, it doesn't mean their cluster of symptoms was not real. It's just only when you come up with that cluster can you articulate a person as that kind of person. But once you do that, that has a feedback loop of what you're going to do, which is why telling someone their diagnosis will change their behavior. And I've seen this with a lot of diagnoses, particularly borderline personality disorder. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I've gotten in trouble for participating on that, even though I am trained on the good bit of it. But not in any clinical way. So I'll let the clinicians talk. But this does lead you to a question. What if a whole field is based on some assumptions that it shouldn't be? What we now read as autism epidemic and an obesity epidemic, we just as well used to read about multiple personalities epidemic or an epidemic of child abuse or satanic ritual abuse if you go back to the late 80s. The conception of autism has evolved, as I discussed in the May 11th issue of the London Review of Books. In 1992, the American Heritage Dictionary of Language, a reliable desktop dictionary that tries to keep in touch, defined autism as 1, an abnormal introversion and egocentricity, acceptance of fantasy rather than reality. That would really bother some autistics today, and it should. And 2, psychology, infantile autism. In 2000, it gave a psychiatric disorder of childhood characterized by marked deficits in communications and social interactions, preoccupation with fantasy, language impairment, and abnormal behavior, usually associated with intellectual impairment. Now, it says of childhood, and this is interesting because we do not think that autism is a childhood-only thing today. The first sense of the 1992 derives from a usage coined by the great Swedish psychiatrist Eugene Buehler in 1908 as named for the behavior of some of his schizophrenic patients. Notice that autism was originally linked to schizophrenia. In the second 1992 sense, infantile autism was a transfer from the first sense and was introduced by Leo Kanner in 1943. The 2000 definition is about as good as you can do with this few words. And it's out of date today now, too, if we look at how it's defined in like 2010 or 2020. It could have added the obsession with literalness, the obsession with order and keeping things the same, terrible tantrums, biting and hitting that follow when things cease to be the same. It could have added that most people with autism, at about 4 out of 5, are male. Not true anymore, but it was at the time. It could have been added that the habit of echoing what has been said rather than speaking. In short, it could have added lots more, but the definition is not bad. The definition is certainly wrong about one thing. Autism is not just a childhood disorder, but is almost always for life. It is a developmental disorder that can be recognized very early in men, although today we would say we often don't recognize it with women until adulthood, usually no later than 30 months, from which there is no known cause and no known cure, despite what we might have had from our government with little to no evidence. At most, it is widely believed a child can learn to compensate for deficits, although there are some remarkable recoveries. Another aspect of the definition which many would protest is regarding autism as a disorder, now the standard euphemism for a mental illness. Many advocates for autism insist it is not a disorder but a disability, which you would hear a lot today. Some people would insist that it's just a different type. It's not even a disability. I'm not here to weigh in on that. I have a lot of people who are autistic in my life, but I actually, I think this explains a lot of what you see with the expanding criterion, but also what exists for autism. I always have to argue with liberals who tell me that, that it's not an expanded criterion, but a refined and more specific diagnosis. But I'm like, the diagnosis does not have one identifiable pathology. It's a cluster of traits. Without one identifying pathology, we can expand or contract a definition as we see fit. Unlike cancer, which has an identifiable pathologies, plural, but even that is actually still somewhat up to debate as to what exactly the thin line between formal and unformal cancer, cancerous tumors or uncancerous tumors are. I mean, that's why we have malevolent and benign as a distinguishing function more than like cancer or not cancer. As someone who's had a lot of cancer scares, I think a lot about this. In 1943 and indeed in 1973, autism was a rare developmental disorder with a quite definite, narrowly characterized stereotype. Today we have an autistic spectrum. Yeah, we already did by the 2000s. We have high functioning people with autism. Now we would call them low needs people with autism. We have Asperger's, which we wouldn't use anymore. A name introduced into English in 1981 by the British psychiatric social worker Lorna Wing. It was adapted from the diagnosis made in 1944 in Vienna by Hans Asperger, a distinguished pediatrician in the German-speaking world, whom Ring made more prominent in English, and then we explicitly rejected because people realized that Hans Asperger was a Nazi, and this was part of their criterion on who would and would not be euthanized. Yeah. For those you know, that's not because Asperger's became an invalid diagnosis. It's because Asperger's has the specter of who Hans Asperger was. So it is an invalid diagnosis as a separate part of the autism spectrum. And now we just refer to high needs and low needs autism with all the associated problems therein. And I'm not going to get into that. Again, not a psychiatrist. It now needs to refer to people who had a few difficulties acquiring language, but also have other autistic symptoms. It is usually synonymous with high-functioning autism. Consider a certain kind of teenager or adult the high-functioning autist. I shall leave Asperger out of it. And that's probably good for hacking to do, considering what was going to happen later in our cultural mores. The typical case is someone who grew up from an autistic child to an adult who had a full or almost full possession of language and some residual eccentricities of an autistic sort, some of which are socially disadvantageous, some possibly advantageous. Temple Grandin is the most famous example. She emphasizes her empathy with animals, urging that her way of seeing the world is closer to that of animals than to most humans. I've heard other autistic people say that to me. I don't know how they would know that, but they definitely feel that way. And I mean that because even though I think my dog has a very distinct and likable personality, I do not know what it's like to be a dog. I have a good idea, since I think a dog as a mammal with a similar complex brain probably has an experience similar to mine and has some functions similar to mine. There are things about dog perception that I just cannot perceive. And maybe that's not important. Maybe I don't need to know that, or maybe I do, but it's just something to realize. All right. She had a significant effect on the American slaughterhouse techniques. High-functioning autists are beginning to crop up in fiction, much as multiple personalities did 20 years ago. In fact, they're all over the place now. Some high-functioning autistic people talk of forming an autism liberation front. Stop trying to make us like you. And we see this a lot today. We do things better than you. We do some things better than you, and you do something better than us, so leave us be. Now, what is trial A and B for high-functioning autism? A, there were no high-functioning autists in 1950. There are many in 2000. B, in 1950, this was not a way to be a person. People do not experience themselves in this way. They do not interact with their friends, their families, their employers, their counselors in this way. But in 2000, this is a way to be a person, to experience oneself, and to live in society. As I said, A is, in my view, true for multiple personalities, but is absolutely false for high-functioning autism. So, those of you who hear about mad hacking think it's subjectively real in some key ways. It is almost as absurd as saying that autism did not exist before 1943 when Crowder introduced the name. But B, I believe, is true. Before 1950, maybe even before 1975, high-functioning autism was not a way to be a person. There probably were a few individuals who were regarded as the R word or worse, who recovered, retaining the kinds of foibles that high-functioning autistic people have today, meaning that they were labeled as developmentally deficient as a child, and they, quote, recovered from that developmental deficiency, and they still had some idiosyncrasies, but they were seen as cured. So they were not autists in the way that we might think of it today, because that category didn't exist, but the cluster of traits we called artistic definitely did. That's a fine point distinction, but it's the distinction between Platonism and not Platonism. All right. But people didn't experience themselves in this way. They didn't interact with their friends, their families, their employers, their counselors in the way that they do now. As I see it, this kind of person in the sense of B could not have existed until sometime after autism itself had been diagnosed. And for the first, such individuals had to be diagnosed as autistic and then somewhat mysteriously recover, grow out of it, and acquire social skills, be able to understand that other people are thinking and feeling. Meaning they had a better model of mind, overcome what we now call mask, and in any way live unproblematically with the obsessive need for literalness. Once they were recovered, autists, other adults who had never been diagnosed as autistic, could have been seen as having similar difficulties, even if their childhood was not as bad. Hence, the class of high-functioning autists rapidly expanded. Some will have strengths in one direction, some strengths in another. How does making up people take place? Long ago, hip and square became common names in white middle-class culture. By a parody of Nietzsche, two kinds of people came into being, the hip and the square. As is the way of slang imported from other social class, both kinds have short shelf lives. Just like normie and not normie today, people. It's not fucking new. But I am concerned with the human scientists from sociology to medicine, and they are driven by several engines of discovery, which are thought of as having to do with finding out facts, but are also engines for making up people. The first 7 engines in the following list are designed for discovery, ordered roughly according to the times at which they became effective. The 8th is the engine of practice, the 9th of administration, and the 10th is resistance to the knowers. 1, count. 2, quantify. 3, norms. Create norms. 4, correlate. 5, medicalize. 6, biologize. 7, geneticize. 8, normalize. 9, bureaucratize. 10, reclaim our identity. You can see here the a inquiry to institutionalization, to resistance to institutionalization in a cycle. The successes of the 7 engines of discovery have been astonishing. It is no criticism to say that they have side effects, that they sometimes bring new kinds of people into being in a modest sense of Proposition B, and they affect the kinds of people they study. Here are some brief illustrations of what I mean by each of the 10 engines. I shall use autism and obesity as contrasting illustrations. They remind us that the 10 engines work in different ways on different kinds of people. 1. Counting. The first large-scale word-designed attempt to count autistic children was made in Camberwell, getting a rate of 4.5 per 10,000, which would be about right for core autism as opposed to extended autistic spectrums, which would be what we would call high needs or low functioning autism. There are about 80 published, counting and growing, and as is the proportion of people with autism. On May 4th, Reuters reported that the first national survey of autism shown the condition is very common amongst U.S. children. Well, it's not so common, 57 per 10,000. You will know the horror figures for obesity rates. There is, however, a big difference between autism and obesity, which is nowadays even more studiously counted than autism. Whether obesity is bad, as it ought to be or not, its prevalence has been immensely increased all over the world, not just in the United States, in the past 2 decades. In contrast, we debate whether the swollen figures for autism show a prevalence for autism increasing, or only that we have expanded the definition and are more alert for possible diagnoses. And this is still debated really hardcore, and I don't know how you would even know. Quantity. In the case of obesity, quantity is built in. We have our bathroom scales. In 1903, the Society of Actuaries and Associations of Life Insurance of Medical Directors of America defined being overweight as weighing more than average for the insured people of one's age, height, and sex, and obesity is an excessive accumulation of body fat. During the 1970s, the body mass index took hold, which is actually a population level measurement, not an individual measurement, but I'm not going to go into that. Defined being overweight as having a BMI of more than 25 and obesity as a BMI of more than 30. For a sense of what these numbers mean, Leopold Bloom had a BMI of 23.8. Marilyn Monroe varied between 21 and 24. Underweight is defined as below 18.5. During the past 20 years, models in Playboy have gone down from 19 to 6.5. Fallujah Singh, the fastest man on Earth over age of 90, has a BMI of 15.4. Autism resists quantity. There are many diagnostic questionnaires, but it's hard to qualify deficits. Norms. George Calgims, I don't know how you say that. The Normal to the Pathological in 1943 shows how medicine acquired the concept of normalcy not long after 1800. Many of our examples are deviations from the norm, for better, genius, or worse, obesity. Kangulim addressed the question, which comes first, normalcy or deviance? There is no general answer. Sometimes one, sometimes the other, often hand in hand. Qualitative norms followed Adolphe Coulette's Homme Moyen in the 19th century. That is to say that autism is developed as a developmental disorder, is to say that autistic children do not develop normally. Norms for development, the ages at which children usually do such and such, can be expected to do such and such, ought to be able to do such and such, such as tie their shoelaces, are standard parts of manuals on child rearing for parents. Less so now, actually, but yeah. Correlation. This is a fundamental engine of the social sciences. It began around 1870 when Francis Galton devised a correlation coefficient. Quetelet led the mean, but Galton made the deviation from the mean the core of his social philosophy, and so devised the correlation coefficient. We try to correlate autism with everything, not excluding the relative lengths of the mother's fingers and the amount of testosterone in the fetus. Some correlations have no statistical theory or analysis. 4 out of 5 children with autism are male. On the other hand, body weight needs more subtle statistics. A BMI between 25 and 50 is said to be bad for you because significant correlation with a number of risk factors, which are themselves statistical entities. It is a strange situation. Being overweight, unlike being obese, does not importantly affect your life expectancy, but unless you are a bodybuilder or a rugby forward, it makes you less attractive in current society, less physically active, and so forth. But only statistically speaking, because a lot of people are bodybuilders, et cetera, et cetera. Clinical medicine. We medicalize the kinds of deviant people relentlessly, not always with success. The modern concept of child abuse was introduced by doctors in around 1960, but there have been substantial battles over a medical model ever since. There have always been fat people, some of them ill, but stout, plump persons have often been in fashion, as the works of Rubens and Renoir remind us, as it was associated with wealth. Let me have men about me that are fat, sleek-headed, and sleep o' nights. Today, we treat stout as having medical problems and the obese as needing medical attention. A new generation of anti-craving medicines is about to make a fortune for its owners. That didn't really work so well, but we have now seen new stuff like Ozempic. Autism was regarded as a diagnosis made by a child psychiatrist, and so was followed as a mental disorder, and hence, in the end, as a medical problem. But if we regard it more and more as a disability, it may seem less and less medical. Biology, including neurology. Autism is a disability, but it has biological causes, specifically neurobiological. One of the great moral benefits of biologizing is that it relieves a person of responsibility. Well, I'm not sure that it actually does, but people seem to think it does. This is just me here. This is not hacking. Because you do things to your body that even you do that can cause feedback loops that you don't control. But you may have started the feedback loops. If overeating is attributed to a chemical imbalance, it ceases to be a moral deficit. For most people, if they believe in free will, which, okay. Genetics. There's a constant drive to trace the medical to the biological and the biological to the genetic. This is not wholly new. A century ago, there was a great push to discover the genetic origins of criminal behavior, the criminal personality, and so forth. We haven't found a lot of the genes we've looked for. There has not been found a gay gene, for example. It just doesn't seem to exist. Normalization. In many cases, we try to make the unfavorable deviants as close to normal as possible. And we do this two ways. Once by trying to make them fit in, and then later on by trying to make them more acceptable. Those are the two ways to normalize. Yeah, so you can either force the patient to normalize themselves or hope the society normalizes with regard to the patient. Either one is still a normalization. The point is that behavioral therapists for autism are anti-craving drugs for obesity. A perspective different from mine would emphasize that this is where all the action is. It would urge that ideas do not change people, treatments do, rather behavior or pharmaceutical. Our society changes what it means. That's also a form of normalization. Bureaucracy. Some schools of thought speak of bureaucratic power if it were always a bad thing. Let me emphasize the positive. Most prosperous nations have complex bureaucracies that pick out children with developmental problems in the early years of schooling and assign them to special services. The system sees itself as an objective way to determine who needs help, but the relation is reciprocal. And it's not unproblematic, actually. I can go into a lot. This is an area where actually, affects my day job, and I was affected by it as a child. As a working class person who was identified by a school district with aphasia and dyslexia, I also got all kinds of other stuff tacked onto that as well. I don't talk about it a lot, but it was not necessarily a fun experience, and I didn't enter a normal English class until I was in high school. All right. The criteria used by the system in turn to define what is to fall under various categories, such as autistic. There's an ongoing feedback effect, and once again, obesity is a contrast case. For it has not yet, in any important way, been bureaucratized. Nope, we still haven't figured out how to bureaucratize obesity. Resistance. Kinds of people who are medicalized, normalized, administered, and increasingly have to try to take back control from the experts and institutions, sometimes by creating new experts and new institutions. The famous case being homosexuality, so highly medicalized from the time of Kraft Ebing in the late 19th century. That is a very period in which legal institutions became active in punishing it. Gay pride and its predecessors restored to homosexuals a control of classification in which they fell. Again, we'd say queers now, but people can do what they want. I know that's even controversy in some areas of the LGBT community. There are always twists and turns and tales of making up people. Few more striking than to geneticized male homosexuality to find a gay gene, which we have still not found, and your reports have indicated we have not found it. I have mentioned motions towards an autism liberation front. Well, we've seen something like that. I wouldn't call itself that. That's very new left. Something that would make the high-functioning autistic people the experts on their own condition. We have seen a lot of that. Freddie DeBoer talks about that and even refers to it as a gentrification of the condition. because only the high-functioning people can speak to it. There are a number of organizations of overweight and obese people trying to reinstall pride and dignity in heavy bodies. Oh, yeah, was that in fashion for a long time? And I don't even think it was all bad. People might think that I think that dignity for obese people was a problem, because I don't. I mean, I am myself overweight. I used to be morbidly obese. I might even be on the very low end of obese. I haven't looked at my BMI in a while. Because I have issues with it, but nonetheless. And I say all this just to say that like this is not me hating on fat people. And I actually prefer the word fat too. It just seems more honest. And most fat people I know kind of do, although I respect what people ask me to call them. And I don't really comment on people's bodies that much anyway. I think having pride and dignity in something, and also dealing with the health complications, which are complicated and also complicated by mitigating factors like sociological treatment. I completely admit that. I've read all the healthy at any size stuff, and I've also read a lot of the correlative stuff on diabetes and whatever. But I can tell you, just personally, I lost weight. My insulin resistance got a lot better. A lot more than treating it with drugs did. I'm just being honest with you people right now. I'm not here to judge anyone. And I might sound like I'm being overly precious here, but also the emphasis on the way weight is seen as a relationship to one's moral character, not just an action which one can easily fix, is highly variable from society to society. When I was in East Asia, people had no problem calling you fat, and they didn't think it was mean. They thought they were helping you realize that you probably needed to eat less, which is not necessarily helpful, but there was not the same stigma that we attached to it. People did not get mad. They did not understand why you got mad. There's more pressures to be thin, actually, in those cultures, and you still have obesity there. All right. All 10 engines, including the 7 engines of discovery, produce effects on the kinds of people whom they are applied. They change the boundaries. They change the characteristics. Names and sorting of modes of inquiry may be eccentric, but they are readily recognizable. Conjectures about obesity and autism abound, but fortunately, there is competition. Different groups make different guesses about what will be corroborated. We might find that there is no genetic basis for autism, and none at all but for a small portion of obese persons. We do have evidence that there's a fair amount of people who it is true for, but we don't know how much of the percentage of obese persons is actually caused by genetics. We do know that obese people tend not to be able to lose weight, and even if they lose weight like I did, they often can't keep it all off. I have gained weight back, although not nearly back to my height at all. This is something that once you enter, you often have to struggle with for the entirety of your life. And there is evidence that non-personal things contribute to it, such as digestive efficiency, which has epigenetic triggers, gene sequences and whatnot. But there's not one contribution factor that we've ever found. So there's no way to just fix obesity except through appetite suppression, which is what some of the drugs effectively do, or through surgery, which is also a extreme form of appetite suppression. Because your body has changed in regards to obesity. And this is the thing about whether or not medicalization actually really does remove agency, because maybe you have done the thing to your body that's part of the feedback loop. It's very hard to say. And again, I'm not here to judge people morally on that. I just want to point out that our categories fluctuate over time in ways that change these definitions. When we're talking about obese people in the early 20th century, we actually mean something different than we do now. All right. There may be in genetic makeup of human beings a rare set of genetic anomalies that are responsible for most cases of autism. If so, it is a fixed target at which we can aim, although we don't know what it is. The anomalies, if there are such, that cause a person to be autistic. See all the claims today. They do not determine the ways of life for autistic people. If we came to know that such a set of anomalies, they might even redefine autism, excluding children who are thought to be autistic because of their behavior. Think about the ways that the disability we call autism has changed its contours and its lived experience in the past 60 years. That is the moving target. And if we change the definition, that target will still move. I hate to tell you this, but this affects most identity categories. In ways that makes even like, oh, it's socially constructed but relatively static, a false claim. And people just try to have their cake and eat it too on this. And it's easiest to see in therapy. It's harder to see in social categories, but it's very much the case. Anyway, back to the case. Often when we generalize, we go into species mode. Indeed, there are books called The Autistic Child and The Obese Child. But some autism advocates strongly object to speaking of the autistic child and prefer children with autism. Person first language, we do that with many things now. See people of color as opposed to colored people. Colored people sounds very 1950s and racist vaguely, or at least liberal people trying to avoid being racist in a very racist society where people of color seems like the hip new jargon, but now we say BIPOC, which is a more specific arrangement of that same thing. Although even BIPOC is interesting because Black and Indigenous are not person first, they're trait first, and then people of color is person first. I actually just noticed that. We're not consistent on anything, but anyway. Other thoughtful people felt the autistic child is just right. A parent who founded the Autism Society of America and wrote one of the first books on the topic did so because autism is who my son is, not just a characteristic. It is part of the boy's nature to be autistic. Except in very rare cases, I'm disinclined to say the same thing of an obese person. Being overweight is always just a characteristic. It is never who the stout man is, just one of his enduring and maybe endearing properties. John Stuart Mill, the progenitor of the doctrine of national kind, left us a good way to distinguish between the two, giving us horse and phosphorus as examples. He would argue that there are endless characteristics associated with some classifications. Thus, horses and phosphorus have innumerable features in common. In addition to their being horses are phosphorus, while white things have nothing in common except perhaps that they are white. Horse, he wrote, was a real kind of animal, what philosophers later call a natural kind. White is merely a finite kind, or a qualia kind, or something. He worried about whether the racists and sexists were real or finite kinds, and opted for members of different races having no more in common than their race, just as Christians have nothing more in common than their faith. Racists and sexists are therefore not real kinds. And this actually persists today, and liberal talks about social construction. This is because social constructed kinds are semi-arbitrary and thus finite, and thus cannot be said to be real. Although I think people realize the problems with that because that makes it sound like the problems aren't real, so they quit calling it real kinds and started calling it stuff like socially constructed. Mill's distinction expresses well the idea that autism is who my son is, not just a characteristic. Autistic children have a range of characteristics in common, distributed on a spectrum, or as I prefer to say, in a space that is at least three-dimensional. Some of these are built onto diagnostic interview schedules for detecting aspects of autistic spectrum. Others, less behavior, are unknown and are so far hidden in bioneurogenetic space. We haven't found those demarcators yet. We know that autism is heritable, but we don't know if it's heritable genetically. All right. This is just not true of overweight people. They have little in common except that they are plump. It's also not true of obese people. They have nothing in common except that they are fat. There are many subclasses of obese people who have distinct biological cause for having their BMI at a very high range. Whatever it may be part of their nature and may bring in a host of other characteristics. This subclass would come close to being what Mill called a natural kind. A rigorous school of cognitive science argues that the tendency to treat kinds of things and kinds of people as if they are essences innate to the human mind. Most people are automatically Platonists whether they realize it or not, and it's really fucking annoying. It does not claim that there are metaphysical essences, only that we innately think and act as if they were. I am skeptical. Me too, actually. Perhaps this tendency might be better studied under the heading of the historical anthropology of scientific reason. The cognitivists will profess that their results are confirmed cross-culturally and applied to 6-year-olds. Well, yes, 6-year-olds who grow up anywhere in the world of scientific reason. And what Marshall Solins, dead friend of the spirit of the show, calls the world system, aka 6-year-olds who have been exposed to Western science and interacting with Western science to be studied would actually show traits consistent with what Western science would find measurable. And while that seems like a cop-out, it's also very, 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 very hard to disprove. It is part of our scientific attitude that we find out about people using any of the 7 engines of discovery and more is a fixed target. We usually hit something, and then we say that we hit was what we were aiming at. What we find out about it is, for the most part, true and not far from the truth. Yet the target we hit is often where it is because the interaction between our 5 elements, ranging from classification through people to experiments. Sometimes this breeds conceptual confusion. Oh, hell yeah, it does. And even social panic and all kinds of stuff. See the satanic panic. We'll get to that. There may be no better example of this than the changing faces of suicide. Suicide is now tied to depression, and an attempted suicide is a cry for help. Nothing is more shattering than a suicide of a friend. Nothing more smashes the spirit of a psychiatrist than the suicide of a patient. Nothing hurts a teacher more than the suicide of a student. And tell me how I know. Nothing seems more awful than for young people to kill themselves, even though they kill themselves all the time. When a wave of suicides passes through adolescent cohort in a native village in northern Canada, well-meaning citizens in the South are steeped in shame and guilt. And they should be. This wholly modern field of suicide and a gamut associated with meanings is the product of interaction with statistical and medical sciences, a family of interactions that began around 1825. The modern regime of intense feeling and meaning that makes us totally confused when we think about either euthanasia or suicide bombings. The latter is a ruthless weapon, often callously exploited by older men who had no intention of killing themselves. It has never left a remarkable response by angry young Muslims who felt impotent when faced by an omnipotent hegemony. It can be used by anyone. Tamil tigers developed much of the early technology. Yeah, I was going to say hacking. Don't just blame it on Muslims. It happened. The Tamil tigers were actually probably the first. The suicide weapon is the polar opposite of the invincible nuclear weapon. They are a match, equally indifferent to whom they kill. They have a great difficulty thinking about the suicide weapon because of our established scientific knowledge about suicide. That knowledge is nonetheless true knowledge about people in our society. The suicides and those who are mediating self-destruction, who meditate self-destruction. They have grown through their lives to conform to the meaning and the stereotypes that the knowledge teaches. Genius has put an amazing number of masks since the word was used in such an effect in antiquity. The term, and I hardly dare to call it a concept, but perhaps one could say a cluster of associated ideas, or maps, or gusts of popular opinion, as I like to say, maps to the fantasies of the age. Athens in its prime, Elizabethan England, Romantic Germany, fin de siècle France. But genius is not a serious concept in our times. It has lost the allure of the Romantic era. That is because we now measure it in the genius of its nature of hers and measure. Starting with Galton's hereditary genius, we have gradually made intelligence statistical with norms. Indeed, the usual IQ tests are so statistical that questions are designed in such a way that a curve of scores forms a normal distribution with a mean of 100, except it doesn't really. For a long time, it actually went up. When the tests were first applied to women, they scored higher than with men with a mean of about 105. So the questions had to be modified to make them harder for women. That's funny. But intelligence is social, and women are taught, I think, but I might be natural, but I'm going to assume taught to socialize. They are adjusted until the mean score for females was also 100. Men and women got separate IQ tests, people, so that the numbers would equal out, and women did better. IQ tests are excellent at evaluating the ability of the numerate and technical child possessing a new kind of literacy to prosper in our times. At the top end, genius is forced into a linear scale and hence off the map. Galton aimed to measure genius, but in fact, he expelled it from our culture. It is part of the deep, ultimately Socratic notion of genius that when it is measured on the scales that stem from Galton and were refined in 1917 in the United States Army for evaluating recruits, true geniuses, and I don't hesitate to use that phrase, will be living somewhere else. It will blithely refuse to interact with the questionnaires, institutions, experts, and knowledge, rejecting classification. As you see, I've just bought into the romantic notion of the genius. Now, identities are clusters of traits that we link together. Those categories are not nominally real. When people talk about the true left or the true right, they're trying to enforce a norm and hide it in a description. But it's really a cluster of things that are associated at any given time. And as the right and left are a directional metaphor, those change a lot because directional metaphors are particularly given to it. But therapeutic diagnoses, pathologies, etc., also change like this. Some of which is because we make real advances in sciences, and some of it is because we socially change the construction of the term. And distinguishing between the two is really hard. And it has moral, economic, and political effects. When you think about structures and how we understand structures, so structures may be real, the clusters of traits may be real, and that there are things that happen over and over again and we can foreseeably name, but naming them may indeed change their manifestation. And that is something that we have to deal with, and most of us don't. And on that, protect your peace. Reading and hacking will come up on paroxysm / ghost Christopher Lashes, hacking under new descriptions very soon.